Well, hello YouTube, it's me Fortmaster, and welcome to a new reaction, and this is The Knight Did Not Enter the Dark Worlds, a case for Chris Knight by blackchestnut. So yeah, this has been suggested in several places actually by one Vput, and they've been suggesting it rather vehemently for a little while now, so I decided that hey, I mean, they really want me to watch this. I mean, might as well, actually look at it, see what, the video has to offer. That being said, I mean, I also was kind of thrown off by the thumbnail of the video, which is literally just a screenshot from, at chapter 2 with big red letters saying, read the dialogue. So yeah, definitely interested to see where this one goes. So, I mean, as always, let's get this thing started. So, of course, as always, original videos linked in the description if you haven't seen it for some reason. Corner video will lead to my Let's Play of the day, and if you like this video or any other video that I make, I'd very much appreciate it if you gave the video a like and subscribe to my channel, because my main goal for this year is to hopefully hit 5,000 subscribers, and at the current rate I'm going, that's totally doable, thanks to every single one of you that, actually subscribes to my channel because you like my content. But yeah, with all that out of the way, let's get this thing started then, shall we?
This is the third video in a series of videos where I try to argue in favor of Chris being the knight.
This is a third. Well, I mean, Vput was the one that suggested, so if they didn't want to suggest the other two first, let's keep watching this one then.
Each video will be covering a different topic and can be viewed in any order.
Oh, okay, never mind.
This video will be covering the topic of how the Darkners know about the knight even though they never met them. Okay, so we all know the drill at this point. Someone says they think Chris is the knight, and then someone else shows up out of nowhere and says, well, if Chris is the knight, why doesn't X Dark World character recognize them? Now, the immediate answer to this is simply that none of the Darkners have actually met the knight, and they don't know who the knight is. And to showcase how this is the correct answer, I'm of course going to go over every time the Darkners talk about the knight. So let's start this off with the Darkner that has displayed the most knowledge about the knight.
Yeah, Queen. Oh, never mind.
So Queen talks about the knight a lot. In fact, she recorded them making the fountain. She also is the only one to call the knight the Roaring Knight, and she knows that the knight used a knife to make the dark fountain, and also has a humanoid hand and arm. So right off the bat, Queen is the Darkner that seems to know the most about the knight. But has she ever met the knight? No, she hasn't. She specifically states that she was acting based on assumptions she made about the knight based on the knight's actions, which of course means that she never met the knight, never spoke to them, and has no idea who the knight truly is.
Okay, yeah, I mean, I remember that. I mean, the whole, again, like, in the video I literally just watched and did a reaction to, which was Stuffed Alpaca's, Darkners in Reality video, she pointed out that literally the entirety of Chapter 2 wouldn't have happened if Rousey had just spoken up sooner and told Queen about the roaring. So yeah, Queen was definitely working... While she was the villain, she wasn't evil, and she was working off a lot of partial and incomplete information. So yeah, I can totally get behind that. But like if you go to King, I mean, he seems pretty evident that, the knight gave him purpose and stuff like that.
And what they want. I also want to point out that if she did know who the knight is, she would have told us who the knight is after she joins our side. She also has a whole database on everyone in town, or at least everyone that has used the library computers. So if she had seen the knight, then she would likely know who they are. So all that together pretty much outright confirms that the knight never stepped foot into the Cyberdark world. But if she never talked to the knight, or saw who they are, then how does she have all this info on them?
I mean, put, evidence towards, basically every program in the universe at this moment, collecting your personal data and such. I mean...
How does she know they used a knife and are called the Roaring Knight?
Okay, well, knife, hand, I can totally get the idea that, she's a laptop, she probably has a built-in webcam, knows about the Roaring Knight as a title. That actually is a very good question.
Well, I do actually have an answer for that. Remember how Queen recorded the knight making the fountain?
Yeah.
The dialogue for the recording says it's not possible to make out who the knight is. I think it's safe to say that this is where she learned about the knife and hand point. And to double down on this point about her learning about the knife from the recording without learning the knight's identity, I want to remind everyone that Queen recognizes people through facial recognition technology. This is an explicit plot point as she can't identify Noelle when she has a box over her head. So the only thing Chris as the knight would need to do to hide their identity from Queen is to not show their face on camera.
Okay. Okay, yeah, okay. Yeah.
Which can be very easily accomplished by simply having their back turned to the camera. And the light and smoke from the fountain would also be blocking their face.
Yeah, very much
and while
so.
I'm still on this point, I do think that Chris likely recorded themselves making the fountain intentionally, specifically to make Queen the chapter boss. As a big reason for why she does all the things she ends up doing is because she got transfixed by the video of the fountain being made, and this inspired her to try and get more made. It's also worth pointing out that the laptop dialogue says that someone left it on, that someone clearly being Chris as the knight. It's also worth pointing out that the other computers are also on. I think it's very likely that Chris turned them all on. And why do all of that? Well, to affect the Dark World, of course. But I'll talk more about that later.
Okay. But at the same time, the question still stands as to if Chris actually is the knight, why are they doing that? Which, I mean, from everything that I've seen so far, I don't think that's going to be, you know, under the scope of what this video is actually about. But at the same time, like, again, like, what is their end goal? Are they, like, doing it to just be purely malicious? Are they doing it to, like, are they, like, actually starting to search for deaths as well, and they're curious? Like, are they just tired of her life and just want to end it all and cause the roaring? Are they doing it somehow to get Azrael to come back sooner? Like, who knows?
However, before I move on from the cyberworld, it is important to talk about Spamton and what he says about the knight. Now, I want to remind you again, the knight never went into the cyber dark world, so Spamton couldn't have met them. On top of this, the Spamton sweepstakes actually confirms that at a minimum, Spamton does not know the identity of the knight. Now, this tweet is worded weirdly. It makes it seem like he has no idea who the knight is at all, while in game, he tries to tell us a secret about the knight. So I'm going to say that Spamton does not know who the knight is, but does know that the knight exists, and does have some knowledge about them.
I mean, you never know. We could be playing with, you know, events happening before that. So, for all we know, the Spamton sweepstakes could have happened, you know, before Spamton learned. And, like, the events we experience actually happened before the events of the game itself. I mean, that'd be, actually, thinking about it, that'd be kind of cool.
And that the tweet is just worded weirdly.
Yeah.
Okay, on to the actual dialogue. So when you try to talk to him about the knight, he says, speaking of communion, Chris, did you know that the knight... And then he starts freaking out and apologizing, and then says, too many excess vacation days? Take a goddamn vacation straight to hell. Okay, so right off the bat, a lot of people use this line to argue in favor of Elven Knight because of the word communion being used.
Yeah.
Now, this is wrong for two big reasons. One, they usually take the line out of context to make the point, and two, they're usually using the wrong definition of communion. So first off, when he says speaking of communion, this is in reference to the previous lines of dialogue where he's talking about himself, where he says he used to just be the email guy, and now he's the ow, it burns guy. And then he says, amazed at this amazing transformation, you too can have a communion with unintelligible laughter. Now what does this all mean? Well, basically, he's telling us how he became the way he is now, and that we can end up just like him through the same means.
Okay, I can definitely see where you're coming from here, but at the same time, with something like that, like, taking the next line out of context isn't really taking it out of context, because he kind of continues the train of thought almost, where it's like, oh, speaking of communion, did you know that the knight, as if the knight was connected to the concept of communion itself, where it's like it's played off as like, oh, you know what that reminds me of, that one of those sort of things.
Now, the important thing to remember is that we pretty much already know for a fact how Spamton went insane. It was from talking with Gaster. So when he said,
having stopped talking with Gaster, because after that, that's when everything kind of fell apart in his life and stuff like that. So really, at this point, I mean, if talking to Gaster was addictive, we're looking at, an addict here.
Says communion with unintelligible laughter, he actually means talking with Gaster and becoming Gaster-pilled. Now about the second point about how people will sometimes use the wrong definition of communion, a lot of people will mistake this line to be talking about the holy sacrament of communion, in which the bread and wine become the body and blood of Jesus Christ. However, I think it's clear, especially after my explanation of the lines, that it's simply using the first definition of communion, which is the sharing or exchange of intimate thoughts and feelings, especially when the exchange is on a mental or spiritual level.
Well, there you go. There's that spiritual level again. So, I mean, like, even if, the whole thing, with it being, Albert, or was that his name? I'm completely having a brain fart here all of a sudden, sorry. But even if it was him, like, he is still, like, the town priest, so, like, any form of, like, exchange would be kind of communion with him, since, his, the whole thing surrounding him is, religious-based.
And I would say that this definition lines up perfectly to the idea that the communion in question is with Gaster. So when Spamton says, speaking of communion, Chris, did you know that the night? What he's saying is, speaking of talking with Gaster, Chris, did you know that the night? And I believe that what Spamton was going to tell us would have informed us that the knight is Gaster-pilled. I think the full line would have been, speaking of communion, Chris, did you know that the knight is just like me? Or something kinda like that. And I think that makes perfect sense when we factor in entry 17, which basically outright tells us that Gaster is the one who discovered dark fountains.
Actually, thinking about it, I'm not totally sold on this idea yet, but, like, kind of continuing a train of thought, that whole, like, that time when, like, he's saying, no, please, no, I'm sorry, I mean, like that. Do you think potentially that could be, like, Chris, like, literally threatening Spamton without us being able to physically see it because of, the shop interface, to make sure that we don't learn about who the knight actually is from Spamton? And because of, the whole thing, if Chris is in fact the knight. Actually, now they said, oh, that really doesn't make that much sense given how he acts later on.
This also makes sense with Chris Knight when we factor in how many connections Chris has with Gaster, like the Soul and Goner Maker sequence and the bunker cutscene. Now, as for why Spamton freaks out and doesn't finish talking about the knight, I have two different ideas about what's happening here. One, Spamton is freaking out for no real reason. Because he's Spamton.
Yeah.
He just does this sometimes. It's like 1/3 of his character. Or they stopped talking because Chris told him to shut up because they didn't want Spamton revealing their secrets to the player. When I've made this point in the past, I've had people tell me this makes no sense as Chris is afraid of Spamton. And yeah, Chris is afraid of Spamton. But it's important to remember that Chris does hold power over him in this moment, as Spamton still needs Chris's help to get the Neo suit. And this would explain why Spamton apologizes here. He's saying sorry to Chris for talking about stuff that angered them. But again, I think it's either that, or Spamton's just freaking out for no reason. Because he's Spamton.
Yeah.
Now before I move on to the Card Kingdom, I just want to say about the other Darkners in the cyberworld, they pretty much only talk about the knight in the context of Queen talking about the knight. So that's why I'm not covering them, because it's just like, oh, Queen won't shut up about the knight, or the knight might be even more powerful than Queen. So now on to the Card Kingdom, which is the much more contentious of the two Dark Worlds. In fact, I find that a lot of people will agree that the knight never entered the cyberworld, but feel very adamant that the knight entered the Card Kingdom.
Yeah.
And I'll admit that it's a lot less clear than it is in the Cyber Dark World. But I still think I can show that the knight never entered the Card Kingdom. Now before I cover any of the dialogue in Chapter 1, there's a few points I need to cover first. So first, why did I start with Chapter 2? Well, the reason is because in Chapter 2, it very much outright states that the knight never entered the Dark World. but the Darkners still knew that the Knight made their Dark World. And as I mentioned before, this was likely done by the Knight manipulating the room before making the Dark Fountain, which is once again heavily implied by the laptop dialogue in which...
I mean, in that case, I mean, you know, just, oh, person, like, stab into the, you know, into the room, then immediately run out. Though the fact that, you know, it's heavily implied that the Dark World was created with Birdly and Noelle in the room. And also, just now I'm thinking about it, the whole thing about, oh, you know, the Knight manipulating the room. Well, I could potentially believe that with Queen and the laptop and stuff like that. You have to remember, Noelle and Birdly were in the room as the Dark Fountain formed. I mean, that's how they were just there. I mean, like, I highly doubt, or at least from everything we've seen, it's not really suggested that they kind of fell into the Dark World like Susie and Chris did in Chapter 1. Given that, you know, they specifically point out that the closet is big enough to hold a large person. So, I mean, it could potentially be just about... So, like, all the computers and stuff being turned on and stuff like that might just be, oh, they're on because the library itself is literally open right now, and they're turned off at the end of the day.
Which it states that someone left it on. This is further reinforced when we see Chris do this exact thing with the TV at the end of Chapter 2. This clearly marks a pattern of action that the Knight doesn't enter the Dark Worlds to empower the chapter bosses, but instead does so by manipulating the items in the Light World. So if we know that the Knight never entered the Cyber Dark World and doesn't need to in order to affect the Darkners in it, then there is no reason to believe that the Knight entered the Card Kingdom. Now, is there any evidence that the Knight manipulated the classroom to affect this Dark World? Well, I would say yes there is. As you can clearly see, the cards and toys are scattered all over the floor and cabinet. I think it's clear, based on what we see happen in Chapter 2, that Chris, as the Knight, was the one who laid out all the toys on the floor, as that would be consistent with the Knight's actions.
I mean, yeah, I could definitely see, because this is supposed to be an abandoned classroom, and given that seemingly the only two faculty we've seen in this school so far were Toriel and Alphys, I would heavily suspect that, you know, Toriel being, you know, the older person and most likely being at the school for much longer, would know what this classroom looks like and would, you know, would have wanted it to actually be, you know, neat and tidy.
If there's one thing to take away from this video, it's that the only thing you need to believe in order for Chris to be the Knight is that the Knight's actions have been consistent. If you believe that the Knight entered the Card Kingdom even though the game tells us outright that they never entered the Cyber World, then you are actively making the argument that the Knight's actions have been inconsistent. Which, in my opinion, would be a weird way to write the story.
Well, again, that kind of points towards, like, the situations of both Dark World's creations were very different, though. Again, Chapter 1 takes place in an abandoned classroom. So, the Knight could have, you know, waited for it to form without fear of, like, somebody coming in and spotting them do it or something like that. While in Chapter 2, again, as I said, it's heavily implied that, you know, the Dark Fountain in there was created and the Dark World formed with Birdly and Noelle in the room. So whoever the Knight is, if it isn't Chris, had to, you know, like, hide in the closet, and then when like Birdly and Noelle came in, create the fountain, and then run out without Birdly or Noelle actually seeing who they were.
I think it makes much more sense that Toby wants us to see that Queen didn't meet the Knight, and then retroactively apply that to King as well. And on top of all of that, it's unclear if the Knight entering and then leaving the Dark Worlds is even meant to be possible. In Chapter 1, both Ralsei and Lancer say that the only way to leave would be to seal the fountain. And while in Chapter 2 we can leave Ralsei's Dark World, that Dark World is also stated to be different than the other ones and have special properties, like being able to hold any Darkner. I think it would make sense, with what has been stated in the game, that the ability to leave Ralsei's Dark World is just another one of those special properties. And that the other Dark Worlds can only be exited by sealing the fountain. But that is just my theory on the matter, and it could be wrong.
Yeah, because again, we have no idea who the Knight is or what other special abilities they are, because currently, apart from, you know, seemingly Chris and, you know, Birdly and like Noelle after being told, they were the first Lightener to know how to create dark fountains. So who's to say like they don't have more experience or just more knowledge about how to interact with dark worlds and how to like seemingly leave them without having to without having to destroy the dark fountains in the first place. And again, as we saw before, like ignoring that, like you could alternatively say again, in chapter 2, they created the fountain and then ran out of the room before the dark world fully finished forming. And in chapter 1, the Card Kingdom is connected to Castletown. And, before we get there, Castletown is basically abandoned with only Rousey present. So, like, Rousey can't be everywhere at once. So, like, what if, literally, create the Card Kingdom and then leave the Card Kingdom into Castletown, which we know is the only Dark World currently that you can leave without having to destroy its fountain. So, like, that's also another possibility right there.
But now let's go ahead and cover the dialogue of the Darkners talking about the night. So let's start with Sham. So Sham says that the kingdom was ruled by 4 kings in the Card Castle, but recently a strange knight appeared and 3 of the kings were locked away, and that the remaining king put him and his strange son into power. So right off the bat, the wording here is very vague about how the events happened, to the point where it's possible that Sham is unsure about how it happened. But there is a lot to cover here, so let's take it one point at a time. So first, the fact that the only thing Sham has to say about the knight is that they are strange, I would indicate to mean that they don't know who the knight is, and doesn't know too much about them.
Or, I mean, you could also, again, pointing back to Candy Boy G, I mean, it could be that every knight's different, pointing towards multiple knights, and each one of them is just a different knight, so Strange Knight, Roaring Knight, Chris Knight, or, just keeps going on from there.
As if they did, they would surely give us a better description of them than just being strange. And I believe that the appeared that Sham is referring to is simply the knight entering the room and making the fountain.
Oh, I mean, the Strange Knight, it's obvious that, the Sham has never met the knight before. I mean, I doubt they actually met the knight themselves. I mean, I very much, I don't think that, if, I don't think that, the knight was ever known to everybody else. I think, while King knew the knight and met the knight, with everybody else, it was very much, the king told them about the knight, and then they just kind of, knew about the knight from there. And I mean, for all we know, it doesn't matter who the knight is. Sham could literally be just calling them a strange knight because the knight themselves is, actually weird. And, Sham can tell just by looking at them.
Not the knight entering the Dark World, as all the Darkners only ever says that the knight appeared, Queen included. Now, onto the point about the other kings. It's very vague about what happened. The only thing we know for sure is that they were locked away when the knight appeared or shortly after. But it never even states that the knight was responsible. Even the dialogue from the kings themselves is vague. They say they all ruled together, but when the knight arrived, everything changed. So what happened with the kings? Well, as stated, this dialogue is too vague to know for sure, but I think it happened one of 2 ways. The first way I think it could have happened, which I believe is the correct answer, is that the knight never entered the Dark World and that they simply manipulated the room in order to imprison the kings. What I believe Chris as the knight did was take the 3 king cards out of the deck and put them into a box of animal crackers before making the Dark Fountain in order to imprison them. Now some people will point to the throne room and how it was damaged to say that the knight had to have caused that damage in the Dark World.
Yeah.
However, I fully believe that this damage could have been from the Light World. If Chris had damaged the thing this room is in the Light World, then it's possible that this damage was then translated to the Dark World in this way. It's also worth pointing out that if you beat Spamton Neo, that the computer that Spamton is on blue screens. So damaging something in the Dark World does affect the Light World, and likely vice versa. I think when you factor in what we see happen in Chapter 2, where we are told that the knight did this with the computers, and we see Chris do this with the TV, then it becomes clear that this is what is happening. And I think the main reason why Toby made it so vague in Chapter 1 is because he didn't want us to have a full understanding of how the Night and the Dark Worlds worked yet. Now for the second way the kings could have been imprisoned, is that the Spade King was inspired by the Knight making the fountain, without the Knight entering the Dark World, and the Spade King himself overthrew the kings. and this is where the damage in the throne room is from.
I mean, that would make a lot of
Now,
sense.
I don't think this is the correct answer, but I do think it's possible. And if you thought that's how it happened, I wouldn't argue with you. But now let's go back to Sham, as I'm not done with them yet. So the last line Sham says is the remaining king put him and his strange son into power. Now, I've seen this line confuse some people, thinking that the him is meant to be referring to the knight.
Yeah, because that is a very weird sentence, because, like, if it was the king, like, putting, you know, you would think that if it was talking about the king, like, putting himself in the power with his son, the remaining king put himself and his strange son into power. Like, where's the self?
It's not. If it was, then Sham would use they or it pronouns for the knight, not him. This him is one of two possible things. One, it's a typo and it's supposed to say himself. The remaining king put himself and his strange son into power.
If it was, but that's the thing, if it was actually a typo, it would have been fixed years ago. Like, with all the theorizing that's been going on, why wouldn't that be just one of those things that just sent out, like, a quick, like, a bug fix, like, oh, fix a couple of grammatical issues or stuff like that? Like, unless, you know, it's actually fixed in the full release of the game, which, if that's the case, oh god, I can imagine a lot of people being angry and confused at that. Like, again, like, if that was actually, like, why wouldn't that be fixed? Because that's such an easy fix.
Or the him in question is Rule's card, as the Spade King did appoint him into power as the Duke of Puzzles. Considering the fact that this line has never been changed, I think it's most likely meant to be referring to Rule's card. But this moves us onto King himself, which is by far the most contentious topic in this video. Many people believe very strongly that the knight directly spoke with King and ordered him to do the things he did. And there is a lot to go over on this topic, so before I even cover his dialogue, there's a few points I want to bring up first. So first off, I want to talk about what Toby Fox has said about how King became evil. In the Undertale 6th anniversary livestream, during King's cutscene, this is what Toby had to say.
Toby was... I don't know, I just want to believe that, like, Lancer had a really nice dad earlier, and you had, I don't know, he's got a nice dad, right?
And then the other mouth grew in and
Yeah.
all bets were off.
I mean, he is, you know, advising his child here. So.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, I think that fountain definitely changed his behavior. For sure.
So clearly, Toby is suggesting that it was the fountain that made King evil, and not talking with the knight.
I mean, he was not very committed to that. Like, what was it he specifically said?
I mean, I think that fountain definitely changed his behavior.
Yeah, it was like he said, I mean, I think that the fountain definitely did change his behavior. So obviously, the fountain did change some things about him, but it's like, it wasn't the only thing. Or it didn't actually change him that much, alternatively.
For sure.
So clearly, Toby is suggesting that it was the fountain that made King evil, and not talking with the knight. I think this makes perfect sense when you factor in Queen, who did that exact thing. She never talked to the knight, but knew about them and their actions, and it was these actions, namely the fountain being created, that made her evil. But was this the knight's intentions to make these Darkners into the chapter bosses? I think, yes it was. And why do I think this? Because we see Chris do this exact thing at the end of chapter 2. Chris turning on the TV right before making the fountain, which clearly has some kind of effect on it. And we know from the Spamton sweepstakes that the TV, or whatever the smile is on the TV, is the chapter boss, who will lead an army of lesser Darkners that we will have to fight our way through, and then at the end, fight the boss. But now let's move on to King's dialogue regarding the knight. So, the big one. Silence, Lightbringer. Your very existence goes against our own. By the knight's will, I shall shatter your heart to pieces. This is the main line that people like to point to say that Chris isn't the knight.
Yeah.
They often say that this proves that the knight met with King and told him to kill the Lightners. However, I do not agree with this interpretation.
Hi.
I believe that what is going on here is that King is simply assuming what the knight wants the same way that Queen explicitly was. I also feel like it's very important to look at the wording being used here. By the knight's will is very clearly a play on the phrase, by God's will. It's clear in my eyes that with the phrasing being used here, that this line is meant to invoke the idea of a religious fanatic invoking the name of God to justify their actions.
Yeah.
And it's important to remember that the people that do this have never actually met God.
Yeah.
And don't forget that Sham also says that the Nightners are like gods to the Darkners. And I would say that the Night is even more so, as they create the fountain that gives their land and bodies form. And I feel very confident that this is the intended idea, as this line starts with a biblical reference. King calls Chris Lightbringer, which is a direct translation of Lucifer. Lucifer in Latin means Lightbringer, and of course, Lucifer is also the name of the devil. What does this line imply about Chris? Well, there is a lot to speculate about this line, but what I will say at a minimum is this points to Chris and Gaster being connected in some way, as Gaster is also heavily connected to the devil. And it's also worth pointing out that this line still makes sense when read literally, as Chris bears the soul that contains light inside it that is used to seal the fountains. And the line about the knight's will also works literally without the knight meeting King, when we factor in the info we get from Chapter 2 regarding will. In Chapter 2, Rousey tells us that the Dark Worlds, and the Darkners in them, reflect the will of their fountain. And
Yeah.
Queen tells us that the knight coursed its will into its blade in order to make the fountains. So with this, it seems like the knight has some way to affect the Dark Worlds through this will, whether that be by manipulating the items, or just from their own will. I think it's very likely that this is the will of the knight that King is referring to. That since the knight made King in charge of the Dark World by moving the items in the room, that King is assuming that whatever he wants is the knight's will. Basically, King sees the knight making the fountain as an endorsement, and that whatever he wants must also be in line with what the knight wants. Though it seems likely that this is mostly untrue and is a wrong assumption made by King.
Yeah, which if I'll again play devil's advocate here, if Chris is in fact the knight, we still don't know why they're creating the dark fountains. Like, as I say this before, are they looking for deaths, like in their own way? Since they can create dark fountains, they'll create worlds to see if they can find traces of deaths, or like, is it just a form of just regular escapism since they're kind of like tired of their life? Is it like just like, is it to get closer with Susie since, you know, they've actually made a friend with Susie and seemingly like their company and may think that the only reason they hang out is because of the Dark Worlds? So many questions.
Also, if your argument is why would Chris set up the King to try and kill them, well, I think that argument is completely toothless, as, once again, we see Chris do this exact thing at the end of Chapter 2, as in Chapter 3, we know we are going to fight Tenna and his minions. So in my eyes, that point is completely mute. And while we might not know why Chris is setting up these bosses, we do know for a fact that they are doing this, so clearly they must have some reason for it. Personally, I think it has something to do with how they recruit the Darkners, because the bosses always get recruited even if we didn't recruit the others. But that's just my guess. Also, if the knight really wanted to make sure we didn't seal the fountain, how come they only set up Spade King to fight us? Wouldn't it make more sense to get all of the kings to fight us at once? And all of the other Darkners in the Dark World only follow King because they are afraid of him, or he pays them. And they all switch sides the second we give them any reason to. You would think that if the knight entered the Dark World and physically imposed their will onto the Darkners by force or by talking to them directly, that the other Darkners would be more invested in the knight's goals, or know what they look like at least. I find it hard to believe that the knight went to the Card Castle to overthrow the kings, but none of the lesser Darkners saw them. In fact, they never once mention the knight at all. Even the kings who do mention the knight never say anything about them. You would think if they met them, they would talk about their height or armor or weapon, but nope. They just say that the knight arrived and everything changed. I mean, let's look at the rest of Spade King's dialogue as well. We have found fresh purpose, for the knight has appeared, the knight that pulls the fountains from the earth, holy fountains whose shadows are creating a new world. Our world! Do you see now our new purpose? Soon this world shall be blanketed in darkness, and darkners shall rule it. So right off the bat, the only thing King says about the knight here is that they made the fountain. Which of course means that King at least knows that the knight made the fountain and maybe how fountains are made. Notably, he never talks about meeting the knight in person or anything like that at all. But then goes on to talk about how the world will be covered in darkness and how darkness will rule it. Honestly, it's a little unclear if King even knows that the knight is a lightner, or maybe by his logic they're one of the good ones. There's also the point that King clearly doesn't know about the roaring at all.
Yeah.
As he thinks that when darkness covers the world, he will be able to rule over the lightners, but Ralsei says that when that happens, all the darkners will turn to stone. Honestly, I see only 3 possible explanations for this. 1, Ralsei is wrong or lying. 2, the knight lied to King. Or 3, King is making wrong assumptions about how dark worlds work.
Honestly, I can very much see the second one.
Now I'm gonna go on a limb and say that number 3 is the right answer, as that is exactly what Queen did. Overall, I see no reason to think that the knight has met with King. In fact, the idea that the knight entered the Card Kingdom at all opens up a ton of potential plot holes, like how none of the Darkners ever tell us what the knight looks like, or how they could leave the Dark World without sealing the fountain. But we're not done yet. I've still got one more goober to talk about. That is, of course, the best character in Chapter 1, Jevil. Now, before I even get to the dialogue, does it make sense that Jevil would know who the knight is? My answer to that is, of course, no. So first off, even if the knight did enter the Dark World, which they didn't, it still wouldn't make sense for Jevil to know the knight from this, as he's been locked up the whole time. So the only way that Jevil could know about the knight is from being gasterpilled. But when we factor in Spamton and how he had info about the knight while also seemingly not knowing who the knight is, then I think it's safe to say that Jevil is in the same boat. Okay, so now on to the dialogue. So after you beat Jevil, he will talk about the knight, and he will say different things about them depending on how you beat him. If you fight him, he will say, "You're fast, fast, strong, strong, but there are yet faster, yet stronger. The hand of the knight is drifting forward. Soon the queen returns, and hell's roar bubbles from the depths. Lightners, can you stop it?" Either way, a mischief, mischief, a chaos, chaos. Lightners from inside your little cell, take me and do your strongest. And then he gives you the Shadow Crystal and Devil's Knife. However, if you spare him, he will say this. "What fun! I'm exhausted. You kids tired me up. Now I will sleep for the other 100 years. Unfortunately, you kids cannot have such a pleasant dream. From now, a nightmare will awaken in your hearts, in the shadow of the knight's hand. Lightners, can you stop it?" Either way, a mischief, mischief, a chaos, chaos. Lightners from inside your little cell, take this and do your strongest. And then he gives you the Shadow Crystal and Jevil's Tail. So right off the bat, Jevil has some interesting knowledge about the knight. Specifically, he knows what the knight will do in the future, namely that they will make the queen return. In my earlier Chris Knight video, when I said that being gasterpilled lets you understand the predeterminism of Deltarune and the future, this is kind of what I was talking about, though there is also a bunch more stuff as well. So Jevil knows what the knight is going to do, namely make a new fountain, and make Queen the next chapter boss. I didn't mention this earlier, but the Spamton sweepstakes also makes it very clear that Spamton knows about the chapter 3 boss. While this could just be explained with Gaster stuff, I do think it could be explained with just Chris Knight without Gaster being involved in this point. Why do I think that? Because King, who is most likely not gasterpilled, also somehow knew that Queen would show up next. Or at least that's what the game implies. He doesn't name drop her, and it also happens after we fight her.
Which,
So I do
again, points towards the whole thing that, King is a much more serious character than the average in Deltarune, and it's only you start making fun of him after he's already been beaten.
think this scene is a little weird, to be honest. So while this might just be because King has some history with Queen, that still doesn't really explain how he knew she would be the next boss. I think it's possible that this knowledge could be because of the Knight, that they somehow knew this because of how the Dark Fountains work. Now, I want to preface this by saying that this part is pure speculation about how the Dark Worlds work, as we are missing info on how they work to fully understand them. But basically, the idea is that since the Knight is making all the Dark Worlds, that all of the Knight's Darkners kind of work as characters in the Knight's story. And while a character hasn't been introduced yet in the story, the author, aka the Knight, has already conceptualized them, and the other characters will talk about them because of that. Other people have discussed this idea before, and I think it's one way that could explain how the Darkners know about future Darkners. Though again, it could just be Gaster, and the King line could just be weird. But now about the spare dialogue. Now, I don't think this is intentional, but I think it's really funny and I really wanted to point it out. So he says that a nightmare will awaken in the shadow of the Knight's hand, and then he hands Chris a literal shadow that shows them a nightmarish reality where they don't exist. I doubt that this is what Toby intended with this line, but I think it's really funny either way. But go watch my Shadow Crystal video for more info on that. But one more thing about the spare dialogue, which I think is more likely intentional, is how at the end of Chapter 1, Chris rips their heart out with their hand, and then goes and does Knight stuff, which I would say fits perfectly with the line. But both of these lines don't confirm that Jevil knows who the Knight is, just that he knows what the Knight is doing, at least a little. But again, considering Spamton knew info about the Knight, but doesn't know who they are, I think it's safe to say that Jevil is the same. But now that I've covered everyone, there's still two big topics that I need to talk about. There's a big point that I have been avoiding until now, and that's how the Darkners know that the Knight is called the Knight, even though they have never met or spoken with the Knight.
Yeah, that's kind of the big thing, isn't it?
I think how the Dark Worlds are meant to work is that the Knight has the ability to impose knowledge onto Darkners in some way. Whether that be through touching the Light World object or through the will of the fountain is unclear. But I feel pretty confident that they can do this in some way. I feel this way because this is the only way it can really make sense, as how else would Queen know they are called the Roaring Knight when she says she never spoke with them? This could also be a way to explain why they don't know who the Knight is and what they look like.
Or, I mean, again, this might be a little, sound stupid or whatever, but what if, in Queen's case specifically, since she's a computer, like, the Knight literally just opened up, like, a notepad document, typed in, "I am the Knight," and clicked save. I mean, it'd be stupid, but it'd also be really funny.
If it extends to being able to block out info. And just to clarify, I think Queen knows that the Knight used the knife because of the recording of the fountain.
Yeah.
But she knows that the Knight is called the Roaring Knight because of this imparted knowledge. And this is why she knows the Knight is the Roaring Knight without knowing what the Roaring is. And the final point I want to talk about is how if Chris is the Knight, then you would have to write the story like this. You would have to make it so that the Darkners know that the Knight is making their Dark Worlds, but not know who the Knight really is. You would have to make it so that the Knight doesn't go into the Dark Worlds and speak with the Darkners. You'd have to make it so that the Darkners are just making assumptions on the Knight's motives. Otherwise, the story wouldn't work. But the truth is that this is true even if Chris isn't the Knight. Otherwise, you would run into a ton of issues between the Knight's actions being inconsistent, how only Spade King saw the Knight in Chapter 1, even though they would have had to travel through most of the Dark World to get to him. If the other kings were overthrown by the knight in person, why don't we let them out of jail in exchange for information regarding the knight's identity? The knight having entered the Dark Worlds at all just opens up a ton of potential plot holes and weird inconsistencies. And we need to have all the Darkners talk about how the knight is the person making the Dark Worlds without them knowing who the knight truly is.
I mean, again, something like that. The problem kind of appears that you're assuming that the knight is personally going around introducing themselves to every, or they would go around the Dark World, introduce themselves to every Darkner. Or alternatively, that they're sort of like an omnipresent presence that as soon as they let themselves be known to one Darkner, like every other Darkner knows who they are and what they look like and stuff like that. Where that doesn't seem to be the thing. Like, at least, again, assuming that that a king actually did meet the knight, it seems like this was very much a one-on-one sort of deal.
Because otherwise, how would we ever know who or even what is making the fountains? As well as explaining why none of the Darkners who we recruit tell us who the knight is. And so the best way to write the story is to have the knight not go into the Dark Worlds, but have the knowledge of their actions still be known to the Darkners. Also, for the one guy who's going to leave a comment saying, well, if the knight never entered the Dark Worlds, then clearly the knight can't be Chris, because they entered the Dark Worlds. Yeah, obviously, I mean enter the Dark Worlds before coming back with the soul to go seal them. Anyway, this ended up being longer than I thought it would. If after watching this video you still don't think Chris is the knight, then I recommend checking out the playlist for the rest of the Chris Knight videos. Now, if you do believe that Chris is the knight, then I highly recommend checking out my Ralsei video. While it's marketed as a Ralsei video, it's actually a Chris Knight video in disguise.
Of course.
And it details what I think Chris as the knight is doing and where the story is going. But anyway, thanks for watching. If you enjoyed it, make sure to like and subscribe. And if you really loved the video, you can support the channel over on Ko-Fi. Links to that in the description. I also have a Discord server you can join if you want to. Links to that in the description. And
I personally don't believe, that Chris is the knight. I mean, I'm kind of leaning more towards, the multiple knight theory or something like that. I mean, though, at the same time, he did bring up a lot of good points. I definitely gonna have to see. I mean, again, chapter 3 and 4 are just around the corner. So, I mean, hopefully we'll get some more answers relatively soon. I mean, we're gonna have to see. But yeah, that's definitely going to be it for now. So, yeah, of course, as always, I hope you guys liked. If you did, leave a like, subscribe if you have not, and I'll see you guys next time. Goodbye.